So I think last week was when I did a Hitchens React video, and I got a request to do another one, and so I thought I would do it, especially because I had another sort of video in mind for me to react to, and this is Hitchens on Vladimir Putin. I've watched this before. I watched it shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, but I can't remember any of it, or most of it, and so let's jump in.
And it strikes me looking out at you now that a lot of you are terrifyingly young and may not even remember what it was like to live in the last months of 1989, or not remember it very clearly. But for those of us of my age, and even quite a lot younger, the sense of human emancipation that occurred with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the ossified form of Russo-communism that had been imposed on Eastern and Baltic Europe, and some of Balkan Europe, that sense is something I can still very vividly call to mind.
Something that I think is notable is the divisiveness in the United States specifically, but perhaps like the rest of the West as well, seems to be particularly high, and I think Hitchens is kind of speaking to this a little bit in that there's no like unified experience in terms of what our goals are or like this sort of thing. I've seen in an interview someone talking about how China, they like one of the narratives that is fed to the people is, look, things won't be that great for you, but they'll be good for your kids. Where it's a sort of an ask of the people to see the bigger picture. Now, I don't know if culturally that's ingrained that well or not in China. I don't have my finger on like the pulse of China, but it seems to me that the internal divisiveness, the United States is almost entirely turned inward, and they're not focused on, global issues related to American values of like freedom and liberty and this sort of thing.
I was in Romania at the time it actually happened, watching the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime, which was perhaps the most brutal and corrupt, as well as the one that was most centered on a cult of personality. And it wasn't just that it was extraordinary.
Notably, Hitchens is kind of pretty against the cult of personality type thing, so I think he would really dislike Trump. I know there's a video of him somewhere talking about Trump, but I think he just makes fun of his hair.
To see so many millions of people in so many different countries and societies simply by folding their arms and adopting an attitude of defiance, revolutionizing and changing their system. It wasn't that it was so moving to see that. It was the realization that the Cold War was over in the other way too. That it was quite likely now that we would not have to think every day of the possibility of a mistake or a crime or a blunder leading to what was euphemistically called in my hometown of Washington, D.C., a nuclear exchange. Imagine thinking of a thermonuclear holocaust as an exchange, but that was...
I love this bit. This is the part I remember. The nuclear exchange is like, it's a rather, you're cloaking something that's like incredibly horrific in rather friendly language, which often, I think a lot of people don't pay too much attention to the way that language and terms are like cloaked or are used to represent stuff in a way that like you get a much different type of feeling from it than calling it perhaps what it like actually is.
The way we try to make the thought go away. It was an extraordinary period. And in those days, some of you will remember, and you can look it up, there was talk of a peace dividend, of the possibility of transferring the enormous resources that we've been putting into warfare into peaceful projects and into doing something about the real victims of the Cold War, who were the inhabitants of the countries we used to call the Third World.
I think that the peace dividend is maybe something that the United States missed out on to some degree, paying so much into like the military-industrial complex. But now, as things ramp up, with what's going on in Ukraine, having spent a lot of money is perhaps a good thing. It's difficult to evaluate because if you're not going to war, spending money on military is, it's not useful. But if you do go to war, it's incredibly useful. And so it's this peace dividend is like conceptually it's an interesting type of thing where in an ideal world no one spends any money on military and you just increase the quality of living for people. So, but obviously that's not how things work. I think that the EU's like policy of 2% GDP per member state is perhaps like a good way to go about things. I
That there would be possibly a new internationalism, a new comity internationally, a new renunciation of force, some spare money, and a common feeling that the values of pluralism and democracy were worth having for their own sake and had, so to speak, proved their worth in ideological combat against both fascism and Stalinism. It was a blissful time to be around, I tell you. That's November the 9th, call it. That's the day the Berlin Wall fell. Ceausescu fell actually not till Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve in Bucharest. So that's the end of 1989. The 2nd of August, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Actually, it's not really strictly true to say that he invaded Kuwait, he annexed Kuwait.
Hitchens is very much against Saddam Hussein. He supported or he was against the first Gulf War, and he supported the second Gulf War, mainly on the back of Saddam Hussein had to be removed, more so than general, United States kind of interference in international affairs. But the point, yeah, I think the point he's getting to is everyone was mistaken about their wistfulness, let's say, following the fall of Berlin
The
Wall.
Kuwait was part of Iraq. It did something that had never been tried before, abolished the existence of a member state of the United Nations, a fellow Muslim state, and member of the Arab League. Quite an extraordinary thing to have done. And around that time, Slobodan Milosevic tried to impose the idea of a national socialist Greater Serbia on his neighbors in first Slovenia, then Croatia, then most heinously in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then in Kosovo, and suddenly it hit me. I shouldn't have been part of this naive chorus about the end of history. And
Yeah, and there it is, where it's not the struggle is you want to work towards this thing, this peace dividend type of environment where nothing bad is happening and you get to reap the fruits of that. But then here we go.
the peace dividend, I had some reservations about it, which I published, but I had shared in the general optimism. Of course we were not yet out from under the rule or the danger that is posed by psychopathic dictatorship.
And we're not out yet. This is just very on point because we're not done yet. Because obviously we have people like Putin around who look, if Russia was invading Ukraine for a reason that was good for Russia as a state, I would find it much less horrific, right? But it's being invaded to profit a single man. It's not benefiting the state of Russia. It's benefiting the man Putin, who is let's see. I heard John McCain describe Russia as a kleptocracy, where it's a state that is run for the benefit of the people in power, not for the benefit of the state itself. And Putin is using his power to just fleece Russia basically for all of its value, and it's not something that is contributing to Russia itself, which would be a much different thing. I mean, I'd still be against the invasion of Ukraine, but it'd be much more understandable if it was to the benefit of Russia. But it very much does not seem to be to the benefit of Russia. It's definitely not now that he's mobilizing and their economy is cut off from the rest of the world, and they are to be a person in Russia right now is probably an uncomfortable experience.
So I had to spend a lot of time, first in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan.
Notably, his boots on the ground time spent in the Middle East, I think, gives him quite a lot of legitimacy in terms of his perspective on the matter. On the last video I reacted to, he noticeably took on, I think, Heston, and asked him to name in a circle what are the countries adjacent to Iraq, and the guy can't do it, and it's like, maybe you shouldn't bomb a country if you can't name its adjacent countries. If you can't put it, locate it on a map, maybe you shouldn't bomb it.
And then in Sarajevo and Mostar, witnessing what happens when dictators are allowed to get their way. And the shameful thought that one had about it was that in both cases, the cases of Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic, they had been allowed to get away with the impression that they were thought of by Western democratic societies as allies.
And this is a big thing with Putin, is we have, engaged him. We have allowed engagement with the West. We have allowed all of his oligarchs access to Western markets. The United States presidents have called him and congratulated him when he wins his election. It's this providing this engagement with the West, or the West has provided engagement because cutting Putin off earlier was an uncomfortable thing and it was not politically expedient ever, and so now we have to deal with it much later, now that Putin has entrenched himself in Russia like a tick.
Even sometimes as clients, or if one couldn't go quite that far, as necessary partners for negotiation. And in fact, Milosevic, I remember being called by the Clinton administration a partner in peace. And I began to evolve the following view of it. Coexistence with psychopathic dictatorships is in fact not possible. And that is a good thing, probably, because
and I think that this is largely the perspective which he gained between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War that made him support the second Gulf War. And it was like, it wasn't a WMDs thing. It was a Saddam Hussein is a psychopath and he needs to be removed.
Nor is it desirable. 2 or 3 years after Milosevic had been called a partner in peace at Dayton, one of his other conditions, as well as not being arrested, was that the name Kosovo not be mentioned in any of the conversations, that the subject not be brought up. That was acceded to as well by an administration so eager to declare a peaceful victory.
I won't exactly say that Xi is a psychopath, but notably, not being able to talk about what's going on with the Uyghurs is something that's going on right now.
In all the years that were spent in trying to contain or even to coerce or to civilize or domesticate this man had been wasted. They had in fact all been exploited by him to advance his program of his mad idea of a greater Serbia. And the same had been true every time people had ever tried to make nice with Saddam Hussein. It seemed that his appetite for power only grew with the eating.
That's such a great line. Hitchens has just got so many of those bangers. Appetite only grows with the eating.
A week ago, Russia proceeded with its agreement with Iran to provide them with enriched uranium. They're also supplying mid-range missiles to Syria. And this is all following a brief meeting with the president about 2 weeks ago in Europe. There's criticism on both sides of the aisle that the president blinked during this meeting. And I was hoping to gauge your thought and opinion on where is the U.S. relation, where are the U.S. relations heading with Russia, particularly with respect to the Middle East, and what are we essentially looking at? Are we again looking at a stare down with Russia, or do you hope that the situation will come around because the sentiment is for democracy is too great?
The stupidest thing that I think that George Bush has ever said, some might laugh at this point and say, how long are you going to go on before you pick one? But actually, I think he said many quite shrewd things, including about the axis of evil. After all, think what we've been talking about just now. Who says he wasn't right to say that was an axis of evil? Nobody says that now. Everything we found out about those countries was much worse than what we thought, for most people to find out anyway. However, I should say the stupidest thing the president said was as soon as he saw that Vladimir Putin was wearing a crucifix around his neck, he knew he was a man who could be trusted.
This, of course, Hitchens identifies himself as an anti-theist, so he's not going to be very sympathetic to any type of religious thing. And even in like his memoir, George Bush goes back and talks about how he just misevaluated Putin horribly, and one of his great regrets was not dealing with Putin in a substantive way. this is mentioned by Gary Kasparov in his book Winter is Coming, which is all about why Putin has to be stopped and why he's an enemy of the free world. Would recommend the Kasparov book.
I have garlic under this, in case you're wondering. And he looked him in the eye and he knew he was a great man. And, I mean, I thought, oh, God. So that really is what you get. If you're faith-based, you get a KGB weasel as your partner. And it's too late to say that you think he's no good after you've endorsed him in that manner. Now, since that time...
It's also just been, I think, politically, like, for Bush, it would have been, like, politically very inconvenient to deal with Putin, as he should have, as it was for Obama as well, I think, before the first invasion of Ukraine. You know, there is one Obama clip that has aged quite poorly in a debate that he has with Mitt Romney, where he goes, the question by the mod is, like, what do you think is the greatest enemy of the United States? And Mitt Romney is like, it's Vladimir Putin. And then Obama just makes fun of him for it. And he's like, we're not in the Cold War no more, son. And it's just like, he doesn't say that exact thing, but that's the idea. It has aged quite poorly, because Mitt Romney was, in my estimation, correct. Especially if, you know, if you look at what's wrong with America right now, or one of the things that's, like, quite problematic, is the polarization. And if you look at the sources of polarization, one of them is Russian troll bots, feeding fire to both sides. And so if you are actually trying to put your finger on something that's undermining America, like, Putin is definitely a good one to point to. I cannot go into great detail on the Russian troll bots, because that's not an area of expertise for me, but dismissing Putin as an enemy was, like, definitely terrible, like, or aged terribly for Obama.
Mr. Putin intervened outrageously in the attempt of the people of Ukraine to make a self-determined government of their own. I do not believe, I say it flatly, I do not believe anyone in the Ukrainian KGB would have dared to try to poison the opposition leader if they thought the Russians didn't know or might disapprove. It is not possible in that milieu for the approval of Putin, at least negatively, not to have been sought. And I think that question should be asked much more aggressively than it has been. Mr. Putin's policy of unilateralism in respect of Iraq at the United Nations, putting Russian interest, or the interest actually of a clan of former Soviet mobsters who are owed a lot of money by Saddam's regime and who were trading on the oil for food program, which is largely run through Russia, was scandalous.
Notably, the way Gary Kasparov puts it is, when they transitioned to capitalism, Russia, instead of having, like, a true capitalism, instead the costs are public and all the, like, benefits are private, and you have a lot of oligarchs, like, gaining power of all the assets because someone has to own the assets now that they're going to be privatized. And what Putin did when he came into power is he seized the assets of people who politically opposed him under basically false pretenses, notably in media companies, so no one could, like, report on him poorly, and distributed it amongst people that he likes. And this is why it's a kleptocracy, like, oligarchy type thing, and not, like, a legitimate democracy.
That's unilateralism at the UN, not what the United States was doing, which was trying to get the existing resolutions enforced. And yes, now Syria and now Iran. And they're very unhelpful about North Korea too, and dragging their feet on an agreement we've had for a long time. I'm sorry I keep saying we. I was in America this morning and I'll be there again tomorrow. You'll pardon that. To build down the existing nuclear stocks, a lot of which are still targeted and still in the silos. That should have been done years ago, and it hasn't been. And this is to say nothing about how he doesn't let the Russians interfere in their own internal affairs, which he does not. I mean, he's quite clearly embarked on a course of one man and one party rule for his own country. So this is extremely dangerous. And it shows that there has been a great Russian chauvinist resentment ever since the events of 1989, the feeling that they are on the losing side and that they're becoming a victim country. This, I think, is incalculably dangerous. And it strikes me.
Okay, so that was actually much less about Putin than I thought, but it's kind of consistent with talked about the was it the Serbia guy, as well as Saddam and also Putin, and talked about how they were like, for the most part, sticking enemies of liberalism and democracy, which is generally Hitchens, who identifies as humanist. That's kind of where he's going to be supporting. He didn't talk about a lot of like the horrific things that uh, were available. So perhaps Hitchens just his knowledge, uh, his knowledge base, I think, does not have that much depth in on Putin and Russia. Would be my estimation, because there are a lot of things that he would very much bring up in a very angry way, I feel like, if he knew about them. So I think a good source for information on that matter, on Putin specifically, is Garry Kasparov's book, Winter is Coming. Garry Kasparov is, for 20 years, he was the world champion of chess. He ran for the presidency in Russia, although he might disagree with that characterization, because he ran as like a performative stunt, not a legitimate attempt, because he knew that it was corrupt and there was no way he could win anyways. And there's like, you could check out my review of Winter is Coming, which maybe I'll put in the description, for sort of more on Putin. But the types of comments that Hitchens made on Putin definitely seem consistent with Hitchens. I was a little bit disappointed with the lack of depth of knowledge. Like, there's pretty strong evidence that Putin, when there was a transition of power from Yeltsin, who was the first president of Russia, to Putin. I believe Yeltsin was the first president. It was like a transitory period from the Soviet Union. I think it was Yeltsin. And what you have is a situation where, like, there's fairly strong evidence that the KGB, headed by Putin, bombed Russian citizens as a means of gaining support for Vladimir Putin, because you pin it on the Chechens, and you want some guy who's going to be tough on them. And there was like a massive scandal where explosives were found in an apartment building by local police, not like the KGB, and they're like, oh, it was just an exercise, and it's like, you can look that up a little bit. Let's see.
Looking out at you or vividly.
Yeah, I want to go back over maybe the stuff. I'm gonna pause and then. Oh wait, there's no more pause button in this version of OBS. That's terrible. Okay, so yeah, this was some Hitchens on Putin and dictators in general. The axis of evil comment. Hitchens' knowledge is much more grounded in like what went on in the Middle East, I think, as well as he's written several polemical books, and it's he has great depth of knowledge on all the people he's written against in his books, some controversial ones, the Clintons, for example, which he's a leftist, but he hates the Clintons. I don't think he would like to be described as a Democrat. In another video, he he prefers to be referred to as a radical. But the Clintons he's attacked, Mother Teresa. Notably, the title of the book is funny. It's the missionary position. But okay. Henry Kissinger. Let's see. He does have the one against God, which is a point that I disagree quite sharply with Hitchens on. Hitchens just feels that religion poisons everything, is the phrase he likes to use. It just turns everything bad. And I just think it's... I'm also an atheist, but I just think it's net neutral. And that... religious people are capable of horrible things, and atheists are capable of horrible things, and that it's correlation, not causation. But okay, that stuff he can speak to quite well. I didn't feel that way as much with like what he was talking about with Putin, although the wind down of Ukraine's so what happened is like Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear weapons on the condition that like they would have their like safety guaranteed by Russia. Now Russia is invading Ukraine. It's like it's insane. You can look that up too. Anyways, I think I'm rambling now. This is less about Hitchens. This has become less about Hitchens and more about Putin. So maybe it's a video for another time. As far as discussion goes, are there any other sort of people that you'd want to see me react to other than Hitchens? I don't want to just do Hitchens. And are these videos like these? My last one did like kind of okay. Still not a lot of views, but like whatever. But is there feedback is appreciated because like when you're having an interaction with someone like face to face, you get to like have a read on them and understand what's going on and like this sort of thing. And it's when you are making like a video, you are just like screaming into the void. You know, there's zero like feedback of whether something's like hitting or like how something sounds or like this sort of thing, and you can kind of glance by the metrics, but that's not. It's a very detached and seemingly I don't think it's necessarily a very good way of going about it. So any type of feedback in general is very much appreciated, even if it's negative. Although if it's negative, I might respond negatively as well. But it's still, I would prefer negative feedback about stuff that's not good over nothing. Anyways, feel free to do the YouTube algorithm stuff. Like, comment, subscribe. And if you've been sitting for several hours, maybe consider going on a walk because it's good for your health. And have a good day.